So our speaker tonight, it seems like he's been on our schedule for a very long time, and he has been. Nick Liadis was scheduled to join us in person last March, and unfortunately, we had to pull the plug on that meeting at the last minute. So I'm thrilled to have him join us. Nick is a cross-disciplinary thinker working at the interface of architecture and avian conservation biology. He's a trained architect who is defining a new approach to architecture by expanding a strong interest in the natural world, in particular bird life. As a research fellow at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, Nick leverages his cross-disciplinary background with the depth of resources at the museum, such as the Bird Safe Pittsburgh program. He has endorsements by the American Bird Conservancy and the American Institute of Architects, and he's hoping to bring both sides together to make buildings and cities safer for birds. Nick, welcome. Finally, we're glad you could join us.
It has been many months in the making, so happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about bird safe architecture. I am in Pittsburgh, and I band once a week at the Powder Mill Nature Reserve alongside Annie, who I know is connected to you all. So happy for the connection there. And in an interesting kind of coincidental way, I also have a connection to the city of Detroit. My mom is from Detroit, and I went to architecture school at Detroit Mercy. So I'm pretty familiar with the bird life of the Detroit area also. So I'm really excited to be here talking about bird safe architecture and bird safe design. So I'll go ahead and get started. As Bill mentioned, I am a licensed architect in the state of Pennsylvania, and I've been bird banding and practicing avian conservation for a number of years now. And so this talk about bird safe architecture is really right at the intersection of those two disciplines. So it's a kind of very timely conversation to be having as we see more and more people talking about bird safe architecture and more cities actually enacting building codes that require buildings to have bird safe glass on them. This talk has been developed alongside the American Bird Conservancy. And their mission very quickly is to halt extinctions, protect habitats, eliminate threats, and build capacity all around birds. And so this talk fits nicely within that mission. So I always like to start the talk just showing some pictures of really beautiful birds, showing birds that are flying around. These are some stunners from a couple springs ago, banding at the Powder Mill Nature Reserve. Of course, many of these migrants are kind of already through the eastern United States and maybe not looking as bright as they do in spring, but nonetheless, top to bottom, yellow warbler, rusty blackbird, indigo bunting, then hopping down to Baltimore oriole, scarlet tanager, and black and white warbler. And then zooming out a little bit more, showing some birds in their habitat, their preferred habitat. Cedar waxwing, yellow-throated warbler, that would be an unusual bird for Michiganders, but one that we see quite often along the rivers breeding in Pittsburgh. Red-headed woodpecker, then jumping down to green heron, blue-headed vireo, and the northern flicker. So before kind of getting into the conversation about bird safe architecture, I also like to talk a little bit about why birds matter. Why is it important to save birds from and prevent them from flying into windows? And there's a couple of reasons for that. The one is that birds are really good at pollination, like the ruby-throated hummingbird that pollinates flowers. We always think about insects as our pollinators, but birds do that also. Another reason in terms of ecoservices is that birds also are instrumental in habitat regeneration. So birds that eat fruit then disperse seeds, and many plants, especially in Central and South America, rely heavily on birds to disperse their seeds in order for them to germinate. And then also pest consumption. This is actually a really big one. Here's a woodpecker eating some kind of wood-boring insect, but there's some really great studies out of the Pacific Northwest at the moment that are looking at healthy bird populations being as effective at controlling certain insect blights as pesticides. So there's a lot of reasons why we should be thinking about avian conservation. And then also just the bird watching industry. It's a sort of multi-million-dollar a year industry in the United States. Of course, there are birding hotspots all over the United States that are known for bird life, for diversity of birds. I had the privilege of banding in the Point Reyes National Seashore at the Point Reyes Bird Observatory a number of years ago. And the Point Reyes National Seashore is known for its incredible diversity in bird life. I think more birds can be seen there than any other place in the United States. So, you know, there are birding hotspots that benefit from birders going to those places, but then also local economies are stimulated where birds show up. So just a couple of weeks ago at Powder Mill, we had a first state record. A brewer sparrow showed up at Powder Mill and was banded. And of course, a brewer sparrow it was incredibly off course. It's a bird of the Southwest. But folks as far as Philadelphia, maybe even a little bit farther, came to Powder Mill to come see this bird. So there's the kind of local economies that are stimulated when rare birds pop up. So the bird watching industry is big. All right, so getting into the discussion, what's the problem? So the problem is with birds colliding with the glass on buildings. This is a photograph by David Fancher showing the imprint of a bird that has collided with a window, showing the tremendous force involved with collisions. And you might think an image like this is sort of rare or an anomaly, but when you kind of look at windows now and scrutinize them the way that I do, this image actually is not too difficult to find. It primarily affects migrating songbirds like this hooded warbler. These are birds that come up into the United States, come into the northern forest to breed, and then return back to the tropics for the winter months. And so collisions can happen on windows at any point throughout the year, though they do increase during spring and fall migration as birds are kind of moving between their wintering and breeding grounds. And they're also foraging a lot more as they're migrating, trying to find food to sort of fatten up, to create or to make those big migratory leaps. There are also bumps in collisions in summertime when young birds fledge the nest and then they begin circulating and begin exploring their environment. And then there are some spikes in bird collisions in winter also, when birds are often flocking together trying to find dwindling food supplies and locating those in order to survive the winter months. And the issue with collisions is because of, as I mentioned, reflections in windows. So this is sort of the big summary image for me. So you can see a kind of very nice reflective building in the background, and then there's that branch in the foreground of this image. And a bird like that hooded warbler, who's traveled thousands of miles, hundreds of miles to get to Pittsburgh, where I took this image, may land on this branch, finding insects to feed on, and then it turns and sees that very inviting habitat reflected in the windows, and it gets tricked. And just like that, the bird flies towards the window, the collision happens, and the bird dies. And so, you know, a bird, again, that has flown all that way can die in an instant if it's chosen to forage in habitat adjacent to very reflective windows like the one you see here. So I mentioned a little bit about sort of avian migration and kind of there being sort of an uptick in collisions around migration time. I want to talk a little bit about the science of avian migration, what's actually happening in spring and fall. And these songbirds are actually migrating at night, which still sort of baffles me when I talk about this. They migrate at night because there's often a calmer nocturnal atmosphere, which allows them to fly more efficiently. And it also allows them to evade predators. So hawks aren't active at night, and so birds can go undetected. And as they're migrating, they're using the stars, and they're using the Earth's magnetic field to help them orient. They're also using geographic features as well, looking out for lakes and mountain chains and major features in the landscape as well. Yeah, they're making these incredible journeys, thousands of miles in a lot of cases. Science is getting really good at predicting avian migration. So I just have a little snapshot here of a map that I found on the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's website that tracks avian migration. So avian migration can be tracked just like weather can. So flocks of birds. This was taken in April, actually right after this talk was scheduled. Birds coming up from the tropics can be seen in mass like this and then monitored like weather blobs. So you can see the concentrations in Texas, that kind of bright yellow. Those are a lot of birds that made landfall after crossing the Gulf of Mexico. And then the arrows kind of point generally to the direction that those birds are heading. But talking a little bit more about Texas, so the map on the right shows the migration map of that hooded warbler that I had showed a few slides ago. So that bird is going to cross the Gulf of Mexico in the springtime. And as it's approaching the Gulf Coast, it's going to somehow have to deal with Houston, Texas, right on the coast there. Houston is 10,000 square miles, huge metropolitan area, a lot of light pollution coming from that city. And light disrupts darkness, right? So light disrupts the darkness that birds actually need to safely migrate and to safely navigate. And it confuses them. And so birds are attracted to light in the same way that insects are attracted to light. And so they end up in cities, and then they face a whole new host of dangers that they aren't necessarily prepared or evolved to handle. As a kind of similar condition of light pollution, kind of jumping over to New York City, to the East Coast, to the Atlantic Flyway. This is, you may recognize this image. This is sort of a kind of localized light pollution within New York City. This is the outline of the Twin Towers. It's the Light Memorial there. And of course, a very poignant tribute to the Twin Towers from 2001. But if you look closely, in those giant beams of light, there are flecks, and those flecks are actually migrating songbirds that are stuck inside those beams of light because they've been attracted to them and they are very reluctant to leave. And New York City Audubon, interestingly, works with the producers of the memorial, and they monitor at night. And when this condition occurs, they give the okay and the lights are shut off, and then the birds are able to finally disperse and either continue their migration or perhaps land somewhere in the city and roost for the rest of the night and then continue their migration later that day. But of course, they're already in the city, and that sets them up for the potential, increases their likelihood that they're going to find a window, find vegetation near a window, and potentially collide with it. So light really does affect migration. And of course, it's sort of the basis also for a lot of lights out programs that are kind of creeping up across North America that encourage building owners to turn off their lights. And it's for this reason. And then here's just a kind of quick chart that shows the sources of avian mortality by humans. So if you look in the right column, a lot of birds perish in the United States and Canada from our activity. So you can see buildings in glass. In red there, up to 1 billion birds die this way. And there's only one thing that kills more, and that's cats. 1.5 to 3 billion is the estimate. Again, with the B, it's billion. So that's a staggering amount of birds. And how that shakes out across different types of buildings, this is sort of really interesting information and valuable information in terms of like understanding, what types of buildings might be more prone to bird collisions. This was a study out of the Smithsonian that looked at 92,000 fatality records of birds. And this is how it sort of shakes out. 56% of those collisions happened on low-rise buildings. So these are your kind of typical office buildings or university buildings that are, I don't know, in the 1 to 5 story range, often made out of very reflective materials. Lots of glass, lots of windows, lots of vegetation that the birds are attracted to. 44% of those records occurred on residences. So, lots of folks have that one window in their house, the kitchen window, the living room window, a picture window that is sort of kills birds, or the collision happens regularly, that kind of infamous thud happening. And then less than 1% occurred on high-rise structures. So larger buildings that you'd see in cities. And I also kind of want to add to this slide also that there are, just one thing to note about these percentages is that also there are far fewer high-rise buildings than there are low-rise buildings, which might also be why that number, that high-rise building number, is less than 1%. There are far more low-rise buildings and far more single-family detached homes than there are high-rises. But nonetheless, you can get an idea about what types of buildings tend to be the worst for birds. And then this is the last dead bird image, kind of staggering image by a guy named Kenneth Hurdy coming out of FLAP, which is an organization in Toronto that monitors buildings throughout the city, picking up birds that have collided with windows for a number of reasons. One, to potentially save any birds that are just stunned, to take them to rehabilitation for hopeful release. And then the second, to just collect data on the timing of migration, the timing of the collision, and to also identify buildings that are problematic in the city, to eventually confront the building owner in the hopes that there might be mitigation measures that are put into place to help with the situation. Again, this image is staggering. These aren't even all the birds that were collected in a single season in Toronto. But for me, the conversation around collisions and sort of dead birds goes beyond just the number of birds that you see here. And that's because these birds were en route to their breeding grounds and they didn't make it. And so it's not just that we lost, this number of birds, but those birds didn't reproduce. And so the brood was lost also. So it's not just that we lose this number, it's that the population can be affected because of this. The birds don't go on to reproduce. And so this is a pair of common yellowthroats that were found outside of a building in Washington, D.C. by Ann Lewis. Both birds showing breeding conditions. So of course their nestlings probably didn't make it, wouldn't have made it because both the parents had died in a window collision. And then also 1/3 of all North American bird species needs urgent conservation care. So all the more reason to address the situation with buildings. And although the past couple of slides are a little bit about the doom and gloom of things, there are some encouraging technologies out there. And I'm encouraged by, the way that some architects and the way some conservationists are working. And I'm confident that in the future we will see a better future for birds in the way that they move in and around buildings and cities. So to understand bird collisions with a little bit more nuance, I want to talk a little bit about how birds see. So here are 3 images showing that the eyes of birds are set on the sides of their heads because they don't necessarily need to see what's in front of them. So our eyes as humans, our eyes are on the fronts of our faces, and that allows us to kind of come into the world, to step into it. We have this very frontal view of the world. Birds aren't always concerned about what's in front of them. They're more interested in knowing what is to the sides of them and what is above and behind them in order to avoid predation. And so this affects how birds see reflections of habitat in glass. Also, birds see into the UV spectrum more than we do. So they do see more color. And this is the sort of basis for perhaps you've heard of bird-safe windows that involve the use of a UV film that's embedded in the glass. That's sort of what the basis of the concept of that material is that there's a UV reflective pattern in the glass that's invisible to the human eye, or fairly invisible to the human eye, but visible to a bird because birds see more into the UV spectrum. I actually don't recommend UV reflective films in windows for a couple of reasons. Not all birds see into the UV spectrum is one big reason. And then also, you really need sunshine to activate the material. And so if you're in a location that sees a number of cloudy days, Pittsburgh is a very cloudy city. And so the product is rendered fairly is not useful on gray days. The UV reflective film isn't activated. So you're only really getting the material to work on bright sunny days. Yeah, I tend not to recommend a product like that. I'll go into some more technologies coming up in a few more slides. But the kind of last slide here showing that birds also don't see contrast as well as humans do. So this is a sensitivity chart that optometrists give people to read. We can see that there are black and white alternating kind of patterns in the image, like as you kind of read into the right of it. Birds would not be able to detect that, the black and white that far into the image. And so because they don't see contrast very well, the sort of unfortunate corollary to all this is that when you think about a bird safe treatment for a window, it has to be very visible. So if humans can't see it, the birds are very unlikely to see it also. So how glass is deadly. So this is going to be a set of slides that are examples of particularly deadly conditions in and around the built environment that trick birds into seeing their habitat in windows. So the first one here, again, is that sort of very classic reflective university building with nice big trees around it. So again, very clearly showing the reflections of the habitat and birds unfortunately seeing very literally and presuming that those reflections are spaces that they can inhabit. And then an image on the other side of the building. Really humans can't perceive the reflection either when you really think about it. That's how perfect they are on this mirrored building. But we see the building components and understand that there's more to that reflection because birds are so much smaller than us and because their vision is so much more focused, they don't detect that window is part of a larger structural system and they don't detect that building as mass. This is another example of reflection, a deadly condition for birds, but a little bit different. So this is a courtyard condition in a building. And, oftentimes courtyards have lots of green space, gardens, trees in them, but also water features. These are very inviting places for birds. So birds that are flying over see that and come down into the courtyard, but they don't realize that they have to leave the same way that they come in. And so once they're in, they forage, they might bathe in the water, and then they go to leave, but they they fly forward into the reflections of the greenery in those windows rather than going up and over the building like they came in. So courtyards are particularly dangerous. This is a combination of threats. This is showing both reflection and what's called a pass-through condition. So in this image, this is a school. There's a lot of forest around this particular building. And so not only are the windows reflecting that habitat, but because of the amount of glass, the glass kind of wrapping the corner of the building, you can see through to the other side and see that there's green space. So birds also see that green space and want to move through the windows rather than around the corner because they're seeing the reflection, but also because they're seeing through the building as well. And you can see that there was an attempt at mitigating that with some decals that are kind of a little sporadic and random across the windows. I'll go into why those don't work well, but there was an attempt here to try and fix the situation, although unsuccessful. This is another example of reflection and pass-through. And I like showing this slide because collisions don't necessarily happen where there's a lot of glass. So this is a residence, and the window here to the right is just, you know, a 3 foot by 4 foot kitchen window, the window in front of the sink. And there isn't much glass around it other than that, but it's very reflective. And you can see in the left-hand image that actually at the right height, at the right elevation, there's a pass-through condition there also. So a lot of collisions are seen on this window because of the very reflective nature of it. So collisions can happen on almost any size window. It's not just the large expanses of glass that are the threat. It can be small punched windows also. This is another example of a pass-through condition, but you're not seeing through the entirety of the building to the other side. So this pass-through condition is kind of showing that this is a building in New York City. The atrium inside of this skyscraper has all kinds of vegetation in it. And so green space is at a premium in a place like New York City. And so birds are desperately trying to find those green spaces to forage. And so the bird isn't going to recognize that there's a window system in front of all that really nice vegetation. It just presumes that that's garden space for it to continue foraging to locate food supplies. And of course, the collision occurs. And I guess I'll kind of like stop for a quick second and you know, if like we look back to that number, up to 1 billion birds die every year, why don't we see the streets littered with birds? And there's a couple of reasons for that. And you know, the don't slip signage at the bottom of that image is reminding me to talk about this, which is that oftentimes birds are swept up with trash by maintenance folks that are patrolling the building very early in the morning. So birds are often just kind of discarded as trash. And then also scavengers are aware that collisions happen. And so rats and chipmunks, believe it or not, and gulls, creatures that would very opportunistically snatch a dead or injured bird, know to patrol certain spots within cities because of the reliability of a food source lying on the sidewalk. And then oftentimes birds don't die on impact. So oftentimes birds are stunned and they might walk or kind of flit into nearby vegetation only to perish shortly thereafter. Powder Mill, where I bird band, is doing some really interesting research on rehabilitated birds, the ones that are collected off the sidewalks that are then taken to rehab, in order to see what the likelihood is that after rehabilitation they will make it. And they're using tracking devices outfitted on the birds before the birds are released. And although the paper and the data hasn't come back yet, it actually is looking like most of the birds that are rehabilitated after a collision actually perish within days after being released. So they do sustain injuries that, although might be treated at a rehab center, surface again and catch up with the bird days later. So anyway, going back to some other conditions that are deadly for birds. This is another pass-through condition, but not a building per se. It's this sort of skywalk. Places in northern states like Minnesota and Wisconsin, I know, have a lot of these kind of skywalks connecting buildings. But what happens here is that birds on migration might find themselves in the street trees lining the street, and they're foraging down the sidewalk, and they don't know that they don't perceive the glass in that structure, and so they don't know to fly above or below it, and continue to move down the line of street trees, and collisions happen quite frequently on skywalks like this. And then also kind of another reflection and pass-through condition. This is a really nice, beautiful, lush green roof. Architects love to design green roofs. We know how good green roofs are for cities because of how they absorb water and help thermoregulate the building. But green roofs and buildings around them can be very dangerous for birds. So this is very lush, inviting habitat to a migrating bird. And because there are lots of glass structures around it, it may not be that this building in particular is bad, but the buildings adjacent to it because of that green roof. Also, there's this kind of really interesting glass structure coming out of the roof of this building, also very close to the vegetation, which probably is a very dangerous condition for the birds that are foraging in the green roof also. And then this is another residential building that has been treated recently with some bird safe treatment that I'll show in a couple slides. These are large picture windows. Of course, the owners of this cabin really love their view of the woods, but because of the size of these picture windows and how reflective they are and the vegetation being right there, they were getting a lot of collisions, and they actually got a collision of a pileated woodpecker on these windows during a party they were hosting. And that was sort of the last straw for them. Of course, a pileated woodpecker being an enormous bird, and you know, any bird hitting a window can be a traumatic event, but that bird hit in particular was sort of the last straw for them. And they've treated these windows with acopian bird savers, which I'll show in a couple of slides. This is an image of the Highline project in New York City. So it's this sort of elevated park on an old railway. Lots of native species on the Highline in New York City, lots of bird life, lots of insect life that has been drawn to this place. But they've put glass railings up everywhere. And so as birds are trying to avoid people and crowds moving between the clusters of vegetation, they collide with the glass on the railings as well. So glass railings can be a big problem for collisions as well. And then also this condition called channeling. So, you know, if birds don't have to fly through vegetation, they won't. So oftentimes birds will fly on sidewalks and pathways that humans take also to make it easier. In this condition here, there's a sidewalk and that meets a glass door with lots of vegetation around it. And so collisions happen here because of that kind of channeling effect. Birds using that sidewalk to areas of green space. But of course, there are glass doors there. And then a little bit about bird flight. And this is sort of the last component in kind of understanding the other component of collision. Birds are really good at negotiating tiny spaces. So that's what allows them to fly through a forest and not collide with each other and not collide with like trees and branches.
So, Nick, I'm going to interrupt and say somebody is out there, has their microphone unmuted. Please mute your microphone because we can hear some background noise. Thank you.
All right, so again, birds are really good at negotiating tiny spaces, and so that allows them to fly unscathed in a forest. Kind of corollary to that, like in the built environment, so a barn swallow, a bird that likes to inhabit, lives around buildings and structures. This is an image of a barn swallow flying between the tiny space of a barn door. That's how agile and that's how good they are at knowing how big they are and what they're capable of flying through. And so I like showing this image because there's it is the kind of springboard into talking about what you need to put onto a window in order to signal to a bird that it cannot pass. So I mentioned that birds aren't good at seeing contrast and that a pattern has to be very visible. A bird safe treatment has to be very visible because of that. The other reason that it has to be very visible and be very dense is because birds really know how large they are and know what they can fly through. And so whatever pattern is put on the window to break up the reflections, to tell a bird it can't pass into what it thinks is habitat, that pattern has to be very dense. And so this is a kind of metric for measuring that density. It's called the 2x4 rule. And if we were to imagine putting a pattern up over a glass window, that becomes that barrier, that becomes that signal to a bird. And if that pattern was just a very basic set of lines, if those lines were organized horizontally, they would have to be organized a minimum of 2 inches. And you can see the chickadee imposed on that drawing to show like the kind of scale of this. And if you were to imagine those same lines in a vertical orientation, they would have to be 4 inches apart. And this is what, again, is known as the kind of 2x4 rule, which again talks about the density of those patterns. And that's sort of the springboard into a whole other host of patterns that can be put up on windows that can deter bird collisions. And so an example of that is a dot pattern. So these aren't lines again, these are dots, and the array of dots is at a density that can successfully or cut down on the number of birds flying into the reflected habitat. So they're breaking up the reflection enough to be that barrier, to be that signal. And in order to be effective and to really break up the reflections, that pattern of dots or lines, and I'll go through some other patterns also, they have to be located on the surface of the window, what we call layer 1, surface 1, where the reflection is happening. So I get lots of questions by folks in architecture firms and all kinds of people who want to treat windows, wondering if they can put things on the inside of the windows or in between the layers of glass. And the answer is, in order to really cut down on collisions, you need to address the layer of the glass that the reflection is occurring on, which is, again, that layer 1. So they need to be on the outside of the window, not on the inside. And how we know so much about collisions and what works and what doesn't work is from the American Bird Conservancy's tunnel testing, which happens at the Powder Mill Avian Research Center, where I band once a week. I also help on occasions with the tunnel as well. And this is where bird-safe glass is tested. And so on the end closest to us is where a bird is released inside of the tunnel. You can see the kind of circular opening. And on the far end of the tunnel, you'll see kind of blue screen. And right before that blue screen are 2 panes of glass. One is a clear control, and the second has a bird safe treatment on it. And there's a net in front of that. And so the video camera that's mounted on the tunnel is looking, as the bird is flying through the tunnel, it's documenting the bird's trajectory and whether or not the bird will choose the clear side. And we want the bird to choose the clear side because that then tells us that the bird didn't choose the side with the bird safe treatment, meaning that it was deterred from that glass because of the pattern on it. And I'll show you a little bit more of what I mean by that. But here's the end of the tunnel. So you can see the clear blue side without the pattern, and then the side with a treatment on it. And you can't really see the net in front of it, but there is a net that prevents the bird from actually hitting the window. And then you can see someone operating the tunnel, installing a pane of glass to test. And then here is a little video that shows what the video camera is capturing inside of the tunnel.
Yellow warbler 51295.
So that was a yellow warbler going through the tunnel. And so again, it shows the clear control side, which, when enough birds are flown through the tunnel, we can begin to assign a rating to how well a bird safe treatment is performing. And so as you can see, the bird is perched on the net that it hit, and then the operator, there's a little latch at the end of the tunnel. The operator goes around to the end, opens the latch, and then the bird flies away. And so, the testing happens during migration. So the tunnel is currently in operation. And because of the sort of uptick in bird safe products out there, there's actually a second tunnel that I'm helping to design that will be the second tunnel in the United States testing glass. So really exciting that there are more and more technologies out there. And then this is just a quick little chart that shows some of the data that we collect. So in the left column, the different patterns that are tested, the amount of surface that is covered, and then the number of flights that were completed in order to assign a rating to that glass. So you can see this glass here is a pattern with very dense dots on it. So before jumping into other strategies to help deter bird collisions, a few things that don't work. One is, so things on the inside of the window. I also get lots of questions about blinds on the insides of windows. Blinds aren't a good deterrent because they're not actually addressing the reflection. So here you can kind of see that the blinds are open and there's a pattern on the window, but if you try and separate that image from the vegetation, you can see that the image of the tree is still fairly intact. And so blinds aren't enough to be a bird safe design treatment. Overhangs, it was thought that large building overhangs over windows would prevent bird collisions because of how much it shades the window. But as you can see here, the windows still remain very, very reflective and collisions still do occur despite the presence of overhangs. And then randomized decals. So the kind of one or two sporadic kind of hawk decals, if you will, that are put on windows aren't really enough to deter the birds. One, because an image of a hawk, a songbird's not going to recognize a kind of silhouette of an image of a hawk in a window as a deterrent. But also you can see that the trees are still fairly complete. A bird could easily get around that detail, seeing the reflections of the habitat in those windows. So what does work? So some exciting things are out there, some exciting products are out there, and I'm going to kind of review those and give you all a sampling of the things that you can do to treat bird collisions. And one of the things that I really like to emphasize as an architect, and when I work with architecture firms and developers, is that bird-friendly building design can overlap with other aspects of building. So security, energy efficiency, thermal regulation, because you're actually treating a window with a pattern, that pattern can also be used to help the building to do other things. And that's a really good argument for a homeowner or a developer to upgrade their windows, because the pattern, the technology on the window is doing multiple things. It's not just helping with the birds, but it's also helping to save on energy costs, for example. So the first example, the first product I'm showing here is the kind of vinyl decals. This is the sort of quick and easy thing to do if you're getting collisions on windows. These are, again, applied to the exterior of the window. They come in a whole host of patterns. These are products by the American Bird Conservancy, but also who gets their products from a company called Liadis. And so these are patterns that are dense enough to signal to a bird that they cannot pass. No bird safe treatment is 100% effective unless you're blocking the window. But these are products that cut down drastically on the number of collisions if they are installed correctly and if they are installed at the correct density. Another kind of variant of the vinyl decal is this kind of vinyl sheet. This is a one-way system. So this was a very reflective building at the Atlantic Cape Community College. So not only were they getting collisions on the reflective windows, you can see what was the kind of former windows here, but they were also experiencing really high cooling costs on this building because of the amount of heat coming into it. And so Kaleidoscape manufactures a product that you can see out of, but you can't see into. And so not only did that take down the reflections of the windows to cut down on the bird collisions, but it also cut down on the amount of heat gain in the building. And so because the sun wasn't able to penetrate the facade of the building as much because of the screening element, there was this additional savings on energy as well. This is an example of the solid sheet that can be put over a window. Kaleidoscape also makes patterned sheets as well that aren't as opaque looking, but again have that very dense pattern on them to deter birds. Another way to kind of reduce exposure, it's a kind of term we use in bird safe architecture. This is another product called Acopian Bird Savers. This is a very effective product on collisions. It's essentially a system of hanging parachute cord. So you can see these very large picture windows on the length of this building, with lots of vegetation around them. They were getting collisions here. And the Acopian bird savers were installed. All it is a very simple rail that runs down the length of the building with the parachute cord hanging off of that. And sometimes the ends of that parachute cord can be fixed and sometimes it can be loose. It just kind of depends on the amount of work you want to put into installing it. But again, thinking about that 2x4 rule, the patterns have to be at the correct density in order to be effective. And if collisions, for example, if you were getting collisions, a lot of collisions by hummingbirds, you might even think about making that pattern even denser. That 2x4 rule is just a kind of generic recommendation. I like to recommend going down in density a little bit regardless, but especially if you're getting a lot of collisions with smaller birds, making it even more dense would just really increase the benefit there. Acopian bird savers are last a long time also because that parachute cord is made out of a synthetic material that is really good at resisting weather also. So there can be patterns that are put onto the glass in the factory. And so the products that I've showed you up until this point are really good for retrofits. So windows that aren't going to be changed out, but need to be treated. Some of the products that I'm going to be showing next are products that you can order with that bird safe treatment, put onto them in the factory so that they last the length of the material. And these are two products. The one on the left is a ceramic product that is baked onto the glass, and that can be put on in a number of different patterns. That ceramic can also help the building thermoregulate. So an added bonus if you're installing these windows on a commercial building. And then the second image to the right is an acid etch that can be put on surface one. Again, that exterior surface, that exterior layer of a window, also in a number of different patterns. The kind of lines here being staggered and having varying densities, just because that is a little bit more visually stimulating. That might be more visible to birds, but also it might fit in with some of the aesthetics of the building also. So there's a little bit of flexibility there in the types of patterns that can be put on the glass. This is an example of a museum that installed a product on a glass building with a ceramic frit. That ceramic product that's baked on, these aren't dots, these are lines. But you can see the image on the left showing it with a little bit more detail, the green space reflected in it, but also the green space being broken up by that ceramic frit on the glass. This ceramic frit actually went against, so that this building wasn't designed to be bird safe. It just so happens that it is, because they aren't getting collisions. This building has been monitored. The ceramic frit on this building was put in on layer 2, but again, the architects didn't know that that wasn't part of the design. So it's just by the fact that ceramic frit was installed on this glass that we can call this a bird safe building. What would be ideal was if the treatment was on surface 1, because it's just a little bit better for the reflections. And then another great thing to do, especially for homeowners, is to be sure that one, if you're getting new windows on your home and you know you're getting collisions, is to make sure that you spec a window that has the insect screen on the outside of the window, because that cuts down on the reflection, but also if a bird does still fly towards the window, it just bounces off the insect screen. And the image on the right showing these windows weren't being replaced, but there was an insect screen being installed. And although you wouldn't need the insect screen across the length of that window, because only one part of it is operable, you can design, you can have your handyman, or you could even do this at your own discretion. You can design a frame to then put that insect screen on, and then put that over the window, and that can help protect the glass as well. And of course, you can pop that out pretty easy to wash the windows as well. So insect screen is a great way to protect the birds, and also cut down on the visibility of the bird safe treatment also. You could even install an insect screen, although this is counterintuitive, you could even install that over a picture window also. I like to recommend that a lot, because folks like the clarity of their picture window. Insect screen would be a great way to maintain that clarity, but to also fix the problem. And then I'm going to go through a couple of commercial buildings also that, again, weren't, in an interesting way, weren't necessarily conceived of as bird safe, but by the way that the architects were thinking about screens and patterns, are really good examples of bird safe design that can be used as kind of precedent for how you might design another building. And so this is the De Young Museum in San Francisco. And this is a building with a lot of glass on it, but over top of the glass is this kind of system of metal panels that have these circular perforations in them. And those perforations are all different sizes. And the architect was sort of imagining different qualities of light coming through into the building because of that screen. Regardless of the size of the opening, the perforations, it's screening the building. And so it's part of the aesthetics of the building, and then also is protecting the glass on the building as well. And kind of funny enough, there's glass that isn't covered. And just to underscore that point that humans can't see reflections or can't see glass either, these dots here are for humans, not for birds, because people can walk through large glass surfaces also. So I like to call this out as a bird safe and people safe building as well. And then this is zooming out a little bit, the same building, but showing that the building really is, looks opaque or looks solid because of that screening element, even though it has a lot of glass around the internal structure of it. The image to the left is an interesting apartment complex, also in San Francisco, where there's a large expansive glass at one end. These are actually old shipping containers that are stacked to form these residential units. And rather than putting the shades on the inside of the window, the architects here put the shades on the outside of the window. And so the homeowners can still control light and privacy on their unit, but in any configuration, open or closed, or I should say in any open configuration, the treatment can protect birds because it's breaking up the reflections, but also is a barrier. And then the second building, the one off to the right, another example of a building that actually has a lot of glass on it, that has these kind of interesting architectural screens over top of it. That help protect the glass, that become an architectural statement, that are part of the aesthetics of the building, and are also protecting birds as a byproduct of their design. And then this is a kind of fun one. This is a little hospital, an eye center, has a lot of glass on the front of the building. But on the outside of the building, the architects conceived of this like really kind of dynamic shade structure on the outside of it. And has enough visual noise and is dense enough where we can look at this as a bird safe treatment as well. So not only is it kind of modulating sunlight and helping with heat absorption, but it's also a kind of visual experience. And then showing the images again of the UV reflective film, that product is out there, even though I kind of underscore it as not the best product out there. And then another glass product called Channel Glass, which has a kind of finish on it that cuts down on reflections. And the result of that is that you don't have clear glass, but you do allow for illumination. This sort of kind of glowing result. You can really see it at night, but also during the day. So the reflections do go down. You're still getting sunlight in the building, but you're not reflecting surrounding habitat that could potentially confuse birds. And a little bit about policy and code. So I mentioned that, the testing tunnel at Powder Mill, right? That we're so busy at Powder Mill that the ABC is going to be building a second tunnel. This is all coming out of the kind of uptick in architects and building manufacturers and developers looking for bird safe products to install in buildings. And it's because there are emerging codes and a lot of policy change happening that is making it law now to protect birds. So this is just a list of the first kind of section there, the mandatory. So places now where bird safe, where windows have to be treated for bird collisions. New York City is, I believe New York City is the newest addition to that list, where all new construction has to have bird safe treatment on it. So this is huge for a city like New York, but also in places like Minnesota, in Illinois, and in Canada. There are some really good amendments to building codes and laws on the boards that are helping protect birds. This really all started in Toronto, and sort of kind of expanding from there. So credit to the Canadians for really getting this moving. And hopefully more cities begin following suit with this. And I'll talk a little bit about in the last few slides here, LEED building. So maybe this is something you heard of. LEED building as a kind of rating system for green architecture, for a sustainable building. And how this kind of works is architects, developers, and building owners will maybe kind of set a standard. They'll want to reach for a certain level of LEED building. And then there are different things that the architects can design within the building to help them reach what level of LEED they're going for. And so credit number 55 in the LEED bill, in the green, in the rating system, in the LEED rating system, is one for bird safe architecture. And so most of the things on this list I've covered somewhere in the conversation today. The one thing that I didn't talk about that LEED credit 55 talks about is what's called a collision zone on a building. And so whether this is on a sort of, residential building or an office tower or whatever the structure is, one thing that I like to tell developers and architects and building owners is that you don't necessarily need to treat the entirety of the building. And so the collision zone is most often simply where the vegetation is. And so most trees usually come up to, let's say, the kind of the first 3 stories of a building. And so the LEED credit calls that out. So in green, you can see the collision zones. The blue means that sort of it's less likely for a collision to happen. That doesn't mean that it can't, but it's just less likely. And then kind of special note here, there's a collision zone adjacent to this section of flat roof on this building, that if there were kind of planters out here, that this becomes habitat also. And so that section of the building would need to be protected as well. And how this shakes out across a glass building is that that would be the kind of the areas that aren't whited out are the sections of the building that we could call out as the collision zone. So you can see the reflections happening there, and then a kind of green roof above there. And those would all need to be treated if you were thinking about making a multi-story building bird safe. And then to just underscore and highlight again that green roofs are a really good thing for cities, but that windows next to green roofs, even though they're very high up, have to be treated as well. So a really lush green roof in New York City, planted, and of course this would be a great lawn for swallows to forage around, but there's glass here, so it has the potential to be deadly. And then kind of wrapping up here, some case studies. These are examples of buildings, a lot of cases that have been treated or are about to be treated. This particular case study, these are the windows at the Point Reyes Bird Observatory. So you might recognize the one image from the section of the talk about what not to do. No building should kill birds, but it's especially important for a bird observatory to not kill birds. So they put up decals initially at the bird observatory that weren't doing anything. I was bird banding here at the time. And so they also had a problem with glare. So because of the way that the vegetation was around the building and how the sun works around the building, they were getting these kind of very bright, deep beams of light that made it really hard for people to work, and also made the space really hot. And so for me as an architect, wearing my architecture hat here, I designed for the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, and they're currently fundraising for this. Something that would both protect the windows, but also would screen the windows from that really intense sunlight. And so here's the design for that. So you can see the existing structure in the back, and then this kind of screening element and these kind of reddish and grayish walls are an exterior shading device. So what that looks like when you're next to the building, showing the kind of shades that are angled in such a way that they prevent the sun from coming into the building, heating up the space. But because they are dense enough, they're designed to be dense enough, and because even in the open condition, they're that dense, it prevents birds from seeing the reflection of the habitat in the windows, cutting down on the potential for collision to happen. Another case study, this is at the University of Minnesota. This was one of their university buildings, one of their educational buildings, just a kind of single-story brick structure with a flat roof. You can see that here. They decided to make the roof of that building inhabitable because it is a flat space. So great use of a space that initially wasn't utilized. They put up a glass railing and made that space a kind of patio. As soon as they did that, that inhabitable roof overlooked green space. You can see the trees down here. The minute that they put the glass railings up, the cedar waxwings that were feeding on those trees didn't realize that there was now a glass railing in their way, and they started getting collisions. And so the emergency treatment was just a bunch of blue tape to stop the birds from flying into the glass. They knew, the university knew enough that that was the problem. And then bird safe treatment of a vertical tape was installed on the glass panels, which has cut down on the reflections and the pass-through condition that was causing a great number of birds to fly into those glass panels. And then kind of wrapping up here, you know, this kind of like this conversation about bird safe architecture is a part of a larger conversation for me that is urban avian conservation biology. So like really understanding how birds move in and around cities, because it's, in many cases, it's unavoidable for them to do so. And so thinking about how architects and city planners and developers and community scientists can all come together to create better spaces within our cities and within the built environment for birds, which actually also translates into healthier places for people as well. And so some questions that relate to that, unpacking that a little bit. Bioacoustics, is it possible to help birds navigate around cities as they migrate through sound? Other kind of multidisciplinary collaborations, like how can an architect play the role as a biologist? In some ways, I'm beginning to do that, practicing bird safe architecture. Studying more the kind of urban green roof ecology, and really kind of understanding that as a kind of habitat for birds. We know birds use green roofs on buildings, but we don't.
Still there.
We don't have any science. We don't have a lot of science, good science about how well they are helping birds. And then biodesign. How can we design things within the built environment specifically, again, for birds? And so that wraps up the talk. We can open it up to questions. I'm always available even after the conversation here to answer questions and to help consult. My contact information is there, but happy to stay on the line here and answer any questions that folks might have.
Thank you, Nick. So here's a quick question. Do you want to be able to have people type in their questions via chat, or do you want them just to shout them out and kind of thing?
Actually, I think typing questions out might be a little bit easier, just so folks aren't talking over one another.
Okay, so while people are typing their questions out, I'm going to ask the first question. It seems to me that there might be two different types of bird strikes. There would be the kind that would be of the migratory birds, and then there's a kind that would be, for lack of a better term, daytime foraging birds. We saw numbers about, various numbers of bird deaths, but is there a way, or has anybody broken out daytime, for lack of a better term, is there a way to determine how many birds die during daytime foraging deaths from windows and building collisions as opposed to migratory?
Yeah, so like essentially comparing resident birds to those that are just kind of stopping over. Um, I don't have any specific data related to that because like even birds that we call out as resident birds do migrate or do move around. Somebody in downtown Pittsburgh found a white-breasted nuthatch the other day, a bird that we commonly think of as a resident, as a non-migratory bird. So I haven't come across any specific data, but we do know, like by running the tunnel, that resident birds are affected by collisions in the same way that migratory birds are as well. My local birds, resident birds, aren't any good at detecting the presence of a building than the migratory birds are. That we do know. But blue jays, cardinals, chickadees, a lot of those birds we commonly think of as birds that are in our backyard that don't go anywhere, but they do turn up as collision victims from the monitoring programs that are out there. Probably migratory birds, we might be able to infer potentially that they collide with a bit more frequency because they are feeding more, because they are trying to make these very large migratory leaps.
Mhm. So Heidi Trudell says to everyone via the chat, summer strikes at low rises are as bad as spring strikes, but a very different set of species.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, so lots of those boreal breeding birds might be passing through Metro Detroit.
Right. So so the kinds of solutions that we've been discussing here are, are they one size fits all, and would they be effective with all the birds in the spectrum?
They are, well, so again, no bird safe treatment, unless you're like completely screening the window, is 100% effective. But that's where the ratings come in from the American Bird Conservancy. And so some products are better than others. And a lot of it has to do with like the density of the patterning. And so, I mentioned the 2x4 rule, but there is, there is talk about how if you're getting collisions of smaller birds, that the 2x4 rule should really be the 2x2 rule. And I think even Heidi reminded me of that there's actually, a big push coming to make the 2x4 the 2x2 rule. But, generally these strategies will work for any number of collisions. So, a pattern of dots isn't just going to work for warblers, but you'd have to do something else for thrushes and grosbeaks or something like that. Generally, these products and these systems are working for all potential collision types in terms of species.
So Mike and Judy Florian ask, Nick, how did you get into this? What got you interested in this line of work?
Oh yeah. Well, the kind of like, I went to architecture school, but I've always loved birds. And so the kind of, to expand the kind of like sappy story there is that I've loved birds forever since I was very, very young. And I started practicing architecture after school. I kind of knew about collisions while in school and even before, but I didn't think about how architects could really do something about it until I got out into the field working. And then until I like really learned about the ABC's tunnel testing and how big the problem was. And so then I kind of felt like through my bird banding that I was doing on the side at that point early on, which I'm doing more and more of, that there was this like tremendous opportunity to like move between both worlds, like the avian conservation, avian biology, and architecture. And now I kind of see myself having both of these backgrounds as a mediator between the two, kind of moving between the disciplines, and hopefully convincing more people to upgrade their buildings.
Right? Not just moving between, but uniting the disciplines.
That's right.
So a question here from someone says, I have a large picture window behind a covered porch. I have infrequent bird strikes. Most of the solutions you suggested limit the visibility out of the window in some manner. In your view, what is the solution that minimizes limiting visibility?
Uh, I'm guessing that question is really getting at like what could you put up that's least that's most minimal to the human eye, is what I'm gathering from that. And you know, the as I kind of mentioned in the talk, birds aren't really good at seeing contrast, and and so it has to be, whatever you put on the window has to be very visible to the birds if it's going to. So if the birds need to see it, humans are going to see it also. And so what I can say is that patterns, although they look kind of disruptive initially, your eye adjusts to patterns in the same way that, you know, that the kind of corollary that I like to make is that, you know, when you go into a room and there's a kind of scent to that space, and then your nose adjusts and you don't smell that anymore. It's just sort of part of you sort of forget about it. The eyes work optically in a very similar way, that a pattern on a window may be very visible initially, but your eyes learn to adjust and kind of see through it. A lot of the patterns also are translucent, so they're not completely blocking the window. And there are some really good like one-way systems, like the Kaleidoscape product, where you can see through it, but from the outside it's very visible, but you can still, like I said, you can still see through it. It's not a perfect, it's not perfectly clear. You can still kind of detect a little bit of screening, but that Kaleidoscape product can be very good. And also, I know it's a picture window, but like installing a frame with an insect screen over it can work really well also, because the eye is really good at seeing past the insect screen. You don't lose the detail and the form of the trees and the vegetation and the flowers that you probably want to admire and look at.
All right, Nick, any final thoughts? No, no other questions. Any final thoughts for you, Nick, before we say goodnight to everybody?
Wait, I have a quick comment from Heidi to me, who also does a lot of bird safe stuff additionally. And she's reminding me that a liquid chalk marker, drawing on the window, especially if you're like getting collisions and you didn't have time to make a bird safe treatment, doing that kind of that drawing can on the window very quickly can help with collisions in a pinch also. So you don't necessarily have to do something, you can do something very quickly and immediately. You know, we're in migration right now. And so that might be something that you could do for the short term, potentially for the long term also, until you get a better product that perhaps is a bit more permanent.
All right. Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much.